over here this time.
Okay. So, thank you, John. So, arguments, group of statements. Notice, I'm just following along the border here. A sentence that's expressed one way or the other. We can get into all sorts of problems, obviously, when the statement is our interpretation of a sentence, especially if it's in a foreign language, like in the Koine Greek New Testament, trying to figure out what exactly is the meaning expressed in this, especially if we translate it and so on. You can imagine all the difficulties there. Difference between a premise and a conclusion. Premises are the statements that are meant to lead you to an inference, which is expressed in the conclusion. And logic, in this sense, is a study of these things. So statements and arguments, what are the truth values? So the truth values are true or false. That's pretty easy. Yes, there's a big argument, has been for a long time, over multi-value systems, such as those that are true, false, or maybe, multiple versions of maybe. The microwave, oddly, was one of the devices that resulted from this controversy, because when they invented potato on the microwave, you put the potato in, you hit potato, and the microwave will cook the potato until the potato is done. And so the argument was there's a multiple truth value here. You've got maybe hundreds of truth values, not just true or false. Well, my interpretation of all of that was really that there's a true, false, true, false, true, false. Is it done yet? No. Is it done yet? No. Is it done yet? No. Is it done yet? Yes, done. And you've got a potato, which may or may not actually be done, depending on how good the microwave is at doing that. But there are folks that argue that there are multi-value systems out there rather than just on-off. Computers can't handle that, really. You have to have some way of so in a lot of respect, you might say that logic, as we're going to be discussing it here, is closer to what you get in computer code than normal everyday conversation. Because computers are not going to go for a maybe statement. They just can't say, if he takes his sword and slices the dragon's head, maybe the dragon will do this. Computers are not going to be happy with you if that's the way you try to encode the program, right? You've got to be very specific. Dragon will be mad and eat said swordsman or something, whatever. And noise will ensue, whatever. Fun thing with page 4 is pointing out that we've got lots of different languages, human languages. We've got what? Spanish, German, Hindi, French, etc. That's kind of curious. I think I mentioned the Asian languages don't seem to have the copula, which make it seem like they can't do these kinds of statements, because true or false statements require a copula, whether you're expressing it or not. Right? And so, if that's the case, and you've got all these languages, no wonder the Chinese and the United States are having difficulty coming to some kind of agreement over trade. If they don't express true or false statements, how can we actually negotiate with them when we think that that's what's really important? Is that part of the problem? I'm not part of that. I've never studied Chinese, so I have no clue if that's really an issue there or not. I'd love to get into that sort of thing, but that would take time, as you can imagine. Anybody studying any of the Oriental languages? Korean? They're slightly different, aren't they?
Yeah, Korean was originally derived from Chinese, but Korean is becoming more and more of a modern language as they keep it continually adapt words.
There's a prejudice in that.
There is.
I heard it, but that's scary, because we're not supposed to.
What time are you done?
9, right, well, I don't actually leave till 9, but
Oh, I have class in here at 6.
one of your folks actually stopped by and asked about that and
And
saw
when?
us already here. Check with Zach, because
Because we traded rooms with, sorry about that, we traded rooms with, 212.
Well, the problem is I'm here until
Right.
9
They
every
didn't-
Monday.
They didn't take your class into account.
Ah.
All right.
Well, I do though.
Right, well, we will get it figured out, so, thanks, sorry.
Logic is involved. You cannot put 2 classes in the same room
Somebody coded that
at the
wrong.
same time. Yeah, somebody, there you go, thinking multi-value systems, and no, that can't be. Yes, no. C. Thank you. So the interesting thing here, of course, is, well, if you're translating a language, a foreign language, into English, it doesn't mean that what that foreign language said means this, like Esregnet or Il pluie or whatever. And we say, well, what does that mean? It means it's raining. No, actually in French, it means il pluie. But we translate it into English so we have a sense in English of what they were saying. Right, you know, if you respect the other language as being a complete system. It's not like, well, if they knew English, they would use it, obviously. No, that's just dumb. You know, the Quebecois are adamant that they don't want to lose their French culture, their French language. Absolutely correct to think that the culture goes with the language. That's the kind of relationship we have with it, right? Etc. But the argument is supposed to be the meaning that's expressed by the statements. And what exactly would that meaning be? Guess what? We're just totally making this up. We can't actually say that apart from all of these languages, it's something else entirely. That's just, we don't have that. I don't know that anyone thought that there was such a thing, a universal human language. We also refer to statements as propositions. That's confusing. Essentially means the same thing. But notice that if you have a question or an imperative, a command, or a request, a proposal, those are not propositions. Those don't have truth value. Questions don't have truth value, imperatives, so that's pretty obvious. Again, the inference is the conclusion. What gives you the sense of a conclusion we call making an inference. Okay, so big section on recognizing arguments, and that's important when we were talking about opinion pages in the newspaper versus the objective news stories. Objective news stories are supposed to give you statements that are true or false. Opinion pages, on the other hand, can still use those, of course, but then you're expecting them to lead into valuative statements that are theoretically neither true nor false. You might want to argue about that, by the way, just because that's like the traditional academic view. Doesn't mean that everyone is going to be in agreement with that. You know, that moral statements are neither true nor false. Whoa, that could be significantly an irritating point of view, depending on your tradition, right? Something else that went along with that, and I can't think of what it was. Okay. So, conclusion indicators, we have lots of those in English. Therefore, thus, so, hence, consequently, in conclusion, it follows that, etc. Those are on the bottom of page 6. And we have premise indicators. that are often in front of the statements that are premises. Because, since, given that, assuming that, etc., that neither the premise indicators nor the conclusion indicators are necessarily there. If you feel like someone's coming to a conclusion, then probably it's an argument. But this is, again, a skill. This is an artistic skill in, fluent interpretation when you think about it. And there's some examples there. I won't go over specific ones. If you've been reading it and you have questions, please feel free to ask, all that sort of thing. Some interesting examples, page 12. Determine whether the following passages contain arguments. They give you one. Our company has paid the highest dividends of any Fortune 500 company for the last 5 consecutive years. In addition, we have not had one labor dispute. Our stock is up 25% in the last quarter. Question is that an argument? No. It's just a description of the characteristics they think their company has. But no conclusion given in that. She doesn't eat pork, chicken, beef, mutton, veal, venison, turkey, or fish. It follows that she must be a vegetarian. Could be a conclusion. That's definitely a conclusion. It's definitely an argument. Whether it's right or not, she might be a robot. Robots traditionally don't eat any food, as far as I know. Which makes certain stories on TV hard to figure out. We can move that. If you want to sit where you were, I can move it over here. This one was confusing. What is considered an argument by the book? The officer shook his head, perplexed. The handprint on the wall had not been made by the librarian himself. There hadn't been blood on his hands. Besides, the print did not match his, and it was a strange print, the whorls of the fingers unusually worn. It would have been easy to match, except that they'd never recorded one like it. The book argues this is a conclusion, an argument, because you have the handprint on the wall had not been made by the librarian himself. Didn't see any conclusion indicator. I was puzzled myself by that, but
Could be a lie.
that's, notice test 1 that I went over last class are all your own interpretation of things. So there's no way I could give you points off for any of your conclusions in those statements. They're totally your point of view. So that's, as long as you send me enough words, that's an A, right? Don't mean to offend folks that are like Hermione and love tests, but sorry. It's just, this is too ambiguous, really, to insist on specific things. I'm sure there are teachers that would actually insist on their own point of view, but they're asking students for something that's not necessarily required. I almost said another word. We must educate our children. This is 19. I don't know when children stop dreaming, but I do know when hope starts leaking away, because I've seen it happen. Over the years, I have spent a lot of time talking with school children of all ages, and I have seen the clouds of resignation move across their eyes as they travel through school without making any real progress. They know they are slipping through the net into the huge underclass that our society seems willing to tolerate. We must educate our children, and if we do, I believe that will be enough. The one problem I have is we must educate. That makes it a moral point of view. Moral points of view are neither true nor false, if you follow that interpretation of the statement. In which case, that could not actually be a logical conclusion, that argument, but it clearly feels like a conclusion that individual is trying to make. So you could play with those.
Well, it's saying that I believe that will be enough, just kind of shows that that was her opinion anyway. His or her opinion, whoever's making that statement.
Yeah, it's definitely their argument.
Yeah.
But should we accept it as a good argument, a persuasive argument? Actually not, I'm sure. Well, there's a reason we accept the underclass, because we can't actually fix them. I'm thinking Christopher here. There's got to be a different kind of career that we could set him in where he will be able to have a good life without the demands of being a modern, fully fledged modern person. And what that person is suggesting is that you can bring everyone up into that kind of modern person that's biologically not feasible, depending on their level of what we might call mental illness. Is it a mental illness, or is it just the way they are? It's kind of a burden to say, oh, you have a mental illness. I have a mental illness, actually. According to the DSM-5, I guess, we're up to 5, right? I have denial of mental illness, which is a legitimate mental illness. If you have denial of mental illness, that's one that you have. I think it only applies if you actually already have another one, and you're denying that. I'm absolutely convinced the only reason I have never been diagnosed by a psychiatrist is because I do not go to them. Actually, I have one that I talk to every Wednesday for years, and I've complained to him that I've been seeing him for years and I'm worse. He's a good friend. He's the one that's 92 years old. Okay. So truth and logic, this is important. Talked last class about statements being true or false. Showed you the square of opposition. Anybody want to see that? I can pull it up so that you're not just staring at nothing interesting. When we get to chapter 5, which will be next week, we'll be looking at translating everyday speech into these. Most of the things that you say that we feel that's true or false don't fit this pattern precisely. But what we can do, of course, is interpret them. Remember, so you're looking at what's the real meaning behind the statement, so we can then fit it into this. Because that's how we would then find out if it is true or false, by comparing it to what you can actually see if what was said is true in fact, etc. So, true or false statements, that's one thing, but arguments are not true or false. Arguments are valid or invalid. So there's a vocabulary difference between the statements that we're talking about and how we determine their value, truth value, and arguments, which when we're talking about arguments, we're looking at a pattern. We don't see an argument up here. These are just the statements in the square. But we'll look at different kinds of patterns. And there are different types of arguments besides the forms of arguments. And some of those are deductive arguments, and the others we call them inductive arguments. Deductive arguments are the ones that give us absolute relationships, so that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true if it's a valid deductive argument. If it's an inductive argument, even if all my premises are true, the conclusion could still be false. But I could still think of it as a good inductive argument, because it might be persuasive. It might not. The problem, of course, is that scientific hypotheses are inductive. So normally, that's another reason why a scientist is not going to say that their conclusion is absolutely true. They're instead going to fudge that a little bit and say, this is my warranted assertion, this is probably going to be the case. Because the type of argument used to give you that kind of scientific conclusion is an inductive argument, and induction doesn't give us the same kind of thing that deduction does. But the trouble with deductive arguments is that you learn nothing new from the argument, because everything that you get in the conclusion has to already be contained in the premises, so therefore you're not going to be getting any new information once you get to the conclusion. All trees are fractals. This tree is a tree. Well, that's now pine tree. So pine trees are fractals. Well, I knew that all trees are fractals, and I knew that that pine tree was a tree, so I didn't learn anything new in the conclusion. It was just basically exploring what you already know when you use deductive arguments. A little bit different would be mathematics. All mathematical systems are deductive systems, as far as I know. I'm not sure if you get into probability, if that's still the case, but I'm not sure. But they're deductive systems. 2 plus 2 equals 4. In a way, we already knew that. It's not new information. Even if it's like a proof that you had heard about, no one knew for sure if it was really Fermat's last theorem, because it could prove it. Actually have people that have come out and said that they've proved it. Even so, it's not like they've found something new. What they've done is demonstrated something that they already had the possibility of knowing somehow. See how we're kind of fudging? It feels like it's new information, right? But at the same time, theoretically, that's nothing in math is new. It's just we haven't figured it out yet. It all follows. And it follows because they're deductive arguments. I feel like they need to tell more jokes, and you guys are going to die. Argument forms. So there's an interesting section on page 30, 31, especially like this section here that gives you 2 argument forms. One is valid, one is invalid. And just to show you that the validity of an argument and the truth value of its statements has nothing to do with one another. They give you all the logical possibilities, although notice, if it's a valid argument and you have the premises both true and the conclusion false, it indicates that is not possible. And that's precisely the point of a deductive argument. The premises are true, and the conclusion must also be true. That's why deductive reasoning is the gem of arguments as far as absolute certitude, especially if you have true premises. So the most famous one, I guess, is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. therefore Socrates is mortal. You've ever heard that argument before or not? That one is considered to be, it's an A statement, each one, so A. And it's figure 1, so that is an example of what the medieval monks called the divine argument. It can't be better. You can't have a better argument. By the way, that's still used. One of the presidential speeches George Bush gave during the State of the Union, I took the time to break it down and analyze it, and discovered that every single argument throughout the whole thing was AAA1, 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 all the way down. And kind of ironic is that argument form is referred to as Barbara, and of course everyone knows his mom's name was Barbara.
If it follows that same structure, I mean, isn't it kind of sort of just a statement then at that point?
It's a really boring structure. But you can, remember, we can interpret.
Right.
And so I'm using what's called the principle of charity, deciding how that would be best interpreted, and it occurred to me that it's definitely AAA1, and then it links to the next one, so that the conclusion turns out to be one of the premises of the next argument.
Just because, like, I've, like, a, you know, in-depth background in sales, and to me it just seems more like you're leading at that point, knowing what the answers you're trying to get.
There are interesting psychological ways to fix this up so that you're not a boring person. So you can skip a statement and assume that the person is thinking logically, will automatically fill it in. So if I say to you, all terrorists are evil, Saddam Hussein was a terrorist. What's my conclusion? So I don't have to tell you that. You automatically plug that in because of Aristotle wasn't inventing this system. He was, what he thought, I believe, was describing how we do it.
I just meant more from the fact that, like, when an argument is, there's two sides, maybe you're trying to argue or persuade somebody one way or another. If something's black and white, like what you just gave, is all right statements at that point. I mean, I guess it's interpreted.
Right. When we get into arguments, usually we're not going to be dependent defeating someone on the structure of our argument, unless we're or they are giving us an invalid argument, in which case we can defeat them by pointing out that their argument is invalid. It's very powerful. But normally when we're upset with one another or something of that sort, we're disagreeing on the premises. And so there's other things involved, really, which we should also be talking about in a little bit. So this is fun. You can see that here. So let me do. So an invalid argument form: no dogs or snakes, no dogs or cats, no snakes or cats. So they give us the form: no M or B, no M or D, no B or D. We could draw Venn diagrams, which will help us see these. We'll do that later. But so I could just substitute. And as long as I'm substituting the same terms for M in both places, for B in both places, and D in both places, what I'm doing is maintaining that form of that argument, which I already know is invalid. But notice, no dogs or snakes. That's true. No dogs or cats. That's true. No snakes or cats. So the conclusion in that argument is true. But the argument is invalid. So that kind of ruins your persuasiveness. And you can come up with a counterexample to show that that person is making serious mistakes. And if your audience is aware of what you're doing, that will defeat that person in their eyes. You'll be the winner of that debate. All beagles are dogs, all dogs are mammals, all beagles are mammals. That's a sound argument. And the reason, now this is kind of interesting too, because the argument is a deductively valid form, and all of the premises are true because beagles are dogs and dogs are mammals. Therefore, all beagles are mammals. So that's deductively valid, plus the statements are true. That's like the divine argument right there. An example. Although, again, notice, you're learning absolutely zilch thanks to that argument. You already know all beagles are mammals. A very frustrating aspect of this is that the best arguments we have give us nothing new. The arguments that give us something new could be wrong. So it really makes it seem like being human sucks, basically. Which I guess that's not true either, because I've never been anything else, and I've been very happy. The older I get, the happier. I think that's because I can't remember the rough things. I don't know. Is that true? The older we get? Well, you wouldn't know that yet, but
Why is that?
you're not older yet. You'll be older tomorrow.
What's the fact?
Counterexamples. 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 First thing I think of when I see a counterexample is when you go into a store and you see a whole bunch of things on the counter. Don't touch those. Those are just examples. Right? I'll take one of those. Okay, well, I've got them wrapped in the back. It was in East Berlin. This was communist. Went to a bookstore, looking at the books, and the way the bookstore worked is you had to stand outside in a line until somebody left the store with a basket, and they handed you the basket, and then you could go in. But once you got in, you were in the line, and the line went up and down the aisles to the register, and then you went out. And so as you were going up and down, if you saw something and you wanted to look at, to browse, you take it down and you're looking at it, but now the line has moved on and you can't put it back where it was. So I handed it to one of the clerks. Didn't find anything in the store I wanted to buy, but when I got to the register, they charged me for that book and handed it to me. I had bought that book by just looking at it. And that was cheap enough. It turned out to be a fun book. It was all propaganda, but nonetheless, very interesting. The other bookstore we would go to where we could browse and pick books, they were all in Russian. We'd come up to the counter and the lady would say how much it was in Russian. But we weren't allowed to speak Russian in East Berlin. So we weren't allowed to let them know that we spoke Russian. So we had to act confused and ask in German how much it was. This is after we picked all these Russian books. It's just absolutely sorry. We were also the only unit in Berlin that could not wear our unit crests when we went in uniform any place. Because if they saw our unit crest, they would know we were in intelligence. Now, everybody else wore theirs.
Couldn't figure
So that
it
means
out.
they could figure out that your intelligence could. You're just not wonderful.
It's just hilarious. Oh well.
Okay.
So counterexamples. So if someone gives you an argument and you know that there's something wrong with it, what you can do is, and what happens typically is they'll give you an argument and it's true premises, true conclusion, or at least the conclusion's true, and everyone in the audience all agrees with that. And feel like, oh, okay, that's a good argument, but you realize that it's an invalid argument form. So what you do is you use the same argument form that that person gave you, but substitute so that you end up with a false conclusion. And everyone's supposed to pick up on the fact that, oh, well, even though I agreed with the conclusion the person made, his reasoning process was not good. Should we follow someone whose reasoning process isn't very good? Hopefully they would say no. instead of electing them. However, so you can come up with counterexamples, and this section gives you some examples of those. So those are fun to practice. Those are the kinds of things that the more you practice them, the faster you get at them, the more useful that could be in different kinds of debate. So, moving on to inductive arguments. This is page 42. Strength and cogency. And this is not my fault, but inductive arguments. A typical example I think of is there's a swan and it's white. Whoa, there's another swan and it's white. There's another swan and it's white. And so 4 usually. Aristotle, for some reason, thought if you saw 4 of something, that proved that they were all that way. So there's 4 swans. It must be the case that all swans are white.
Wait,
Yes? But then you discover black swan. And not just at the ballet, right? Which actually, there's a black swan. There's a movie. We also get an interesting book, by the way, called Black Swans, which talks about just how screwed up human reasoning is. And if you apply it to the stock market and things like that, you could end up losing your shirt, which is why I'm wearing this one today. That was written by an author who really lucked out in the disaster in 2008. He's written other books since to capitalize on his momentary fame. What made him so popular was he invested in hedge funds, expecting that 2008 crash. Of course, since it did crash that way, he ended up, I don't think he made it to a billionaire. He made so much money that everybody was impressed with his ability to predict. There are some others out there that are really amazing in their ability to predict things in the stock market. But the whole market has changed now because they've got computer software that buys and sells faster than a human being can blink. So if you're not investing in the right software, you might not be able to compete. If that's something you do. UAA decided that the 401k is the best way for us to retire. So when I started teaching in '95, he signed me up for a 401k. And actually, I'm pretty amazed. It's doing pretty good. But I refuse to mess with it myself. Fidelity doesn't. They must know what they're doing. Just let them do whatever they want. And hopefully someday if I ask for some of the money, they'll say, okay, you can. However, remember the one quarter, I lost $40,000. Whoa. That could bite you on the name of body part that you feel like inserting there. But it's since recovered. But, it's kind of amazing. I didn't vote for Trump. Sorry, if you did. I know my wife couldn't believe I voted for Hillary. Saw a bumper sticker just today that said, Hillary, prison 2016. Imagine getting into politics. But I have to admit, since Trump has been there, my stocks have gone like, whoo! Wow, I feel guilty about having. How's that work? I don't know. But the stock market, you can't really you've heard, I guess, that people that take darts and throw them at, they end up doing as well as the most famous stock market people. Although there are some that apparently do. Be careful of people like Bernie Mac, right? It's
Madoff.
Madoff. Yeah, Madoff. So,
Bernie Mac is convenient.
okay.
I think he died too.
Yeah, he's got, he is.
I get them all mixed up.
Glasgow.
Bernie. Never didn't vote for Bernie either, the other Bernie. There's just no way that stuff ever works out. Although I like the idea of my kids not having to pay student loans. I thought that would be good. No. that wouldn't happen. Okay. So, no matter how strong the inductive argument, it still can end up being a bad argument. It could still end up with a false conclusion. But we can make them psychologically stronger. And that's really where all this, it's a guess. You're still guessing. But what we can do is make it psychologically more persuasive. It's not going to change the actual outcome. But people might actually trust it more. So an argument such that if the premises are assumed to be true, then the conclusion is probably true. In other words, if the premises are assumed to be true, then it is improbable that the conclusion is false. Whereas a weak inductive argument, that is such that if the premises are assumed to be true, then the conclusion is not probably true. Did I read that right?
Yeah.
Cogent argument. An inductive argument is cogent when the argument is strong and the premises are true. There are ways that you can improve your arguments. We'll do better with this if we get to it when we talk about statistical arguments in the last couple of chapters. The role of new information could change. Here's what we do. And we've got some, this is an important word, it's page 48, that's enthymeme. So when I mentioned that you can make your argument stronger psychologically by leaving out a statement and having that person automatically fill it in, when you think about it, that sucks them into the argument. So that makes them feel like, oh, I think this way myself, even though they might not have before you did that, right? So that kind of sucking them into the way your argument is unfolding persuades them very, very well psychologically. Right? But a statement that's missing, that you deliberately left out, is referred to as an enthymeme. And it could be either a premise or the conclusion. In some situations, it could even be both. It's pretty obvious what you're trying to do. So, how are we doing? We'll move on to chapter 2, or any of you have questions? Now we get into language matters, one of my favorite topics. Somehow that became my first career. So we talk about definitions, various types. This is almost like, who was it that pointed out that Daniel Dennett's book, Inside Jokes, was also a joke if you were inside. Yeah. So in a sense, language matters. You think, whoa, it matters. And these are the matters. That's almost the same kind of pattern, if you think of it that way. Yes, language matters. Intention and extension. So page 62. we talk about terms, there is a word, whatever you want to call it, concept, etc. We have common names, proper names, descriptive phrases, plants, Cleopatra, registered voters. English is very complex. Remember one student was from, I forget, I think it was Samoa again. I love that. Should visit Samoa someday, except, but in any case, she was studying English, and she said to me, I want to learn big words. It becomes obvious, I suppose, that the bigger your words, the more higher status you have. Does that make sense? It's not fair, but nonetheless, it's kind of interesting. She wanted to learn big words, so I suggested, do it yourself, kind of get a thesaurus. So she said, what's a thesaurus? So I thought she actually had a dictionary, so I said, you could look it up in the dictionary, what a thesaurus is. She was looking, not finding. Finally, I came over and looked. She was looking up saurus. She thought I had said the saurus. She was looking up saurus. But so she did get a thesaurus, and she was all thrilled. Look how many words there are. But she said, why are there so many words? Looking at child, for example, we have kid, rugrat, infant, neonate, toddler, what, how many other, child, children, or kid. I mean, what, there's like 20 different words minimum, I think, for a child in English, depending on the nuance, right? Well, apparently, in her language, there was only one word for all of them. How do you figure out how to help someone learn the nuances? Rugrat is something you can only use under, certain circumstances. Right? Can't refer, So do you have any rugrats? That would be impolite under most circumstances. So is that cool? Or what? How do you do that? But English is, by the way, English isn't really a language. We discussed this at all? Theoretically, what are its origins? Anybody know?
Anglo-Saxon.
Supposedly the grammatical structure is Germanic, Saxon, but I've heard 80% of the vocabulary was French. That's totally. But a lot of kids will study Greek and Latin to learn the Latin and Greek roots for words, which turns out to be really good when you're trying to figure out all sorts of things. But of course, we keep absorbing new things. Remember the day I arrived in Berlin, driving out of Tegel Airport, and big sign said, Gute Fahrt in Deutschland. And of course, all the other Americans in the van laughed, because that seemed to them that the Germans were wishing them good farting while they were in Germany. Or good travel, happy travel, right? And reminded me when I was in basic training that everyone, drill sergeants, etc., refer to your sleeping bag as a fart sack. And of course, you're first hearing that, you're not thinking German for travel bag. You're instead thinking that, well, you eat really weird food in the Army and you're out there sleeping in that, so I guess so. But nonetheless, that's obviously where that came from, travel bag. The folk term, gone to the German restaurant in Berlin, it's a Chinese restaurant? Of course. You go to the Chinese restaurant in the Funkturm, which is their version of the Eiffel Tower, if you've ever been there. It occurred to me, Funkturm, what is that? Radio tower. And how many have listened to music that they heard was funky? Where did that come from? You know, if you think about it, where do all these strange words come from? Past the street here in Anchorage the other day, Price. Well, that's the Prussian word for Prussian. I don't know why. One of my favorite philosophers' names is Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum. Means nut tree. Kind of funny, right? It's just all of these. Well, where does English get all of its new words? Is this a gung-ho subject for you? Gung-ho, that's, I think, Chinese for Happy New Year. Well, they say gung-ho fa choi. Did I say that close? I've never been able to say it right. How do you say it?
I think it's gong-hee, something like that, but I don't think it's gung-ho. My wife's Chinese.
Ah.
I have to try to keep up with that.
Well, there are different areas of China with different pronunciations. Dialects.
Well, kanji.
Kanji.
My mom's
Manchurian.
Japanese.
Ochin Horatio. But that would be
Pardon.
that would be Russian with a British accent. Sorry.
Christian with British accent. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, in Berlin, some of our fellow folks there were Brits. And you know, it was funny, they oddly had a British accent. And they really did. It's not just like they were acting like they had a British accent. They really did have British accents. So the Russian, and funniest thing was listening to the Chinese waiters in the German restaurant, the German Chinese restaurant, who spoke German with a Chinese accent. That was weird. But so I usually point out that English is a hodgepodge instead of, well, hodgepodge is Hungarian, as far as I know. You might also say that English is a mishmash, which is Yiddish, as far as I know.
And gung-ho, I think means all together.
All together?
All is one.
I've heard it could actually have come from the Korean War, but I don't know. We don't really know. There's some really interesting books. One of the funniest books out there is this one. That's
Is that like in your ear?
is that a fish in your ear? Doesn't that just make you want to read the book and find out what that's all about? But the head of the foreign language department at Princeton wrote that. And it's absolutely hilarious. Another interesting one was Umberto Eco, Problems in Translation. Very little book. Keep in mind that Umberto Eco writes in Italian. Well, he did. He died in 2016. But, so the book is actually translated into English from the Italian. So it's a translator's version of his describing in Italian the problems he has in translating his books into other languages. So it's just hilarious. on top of that, the theory that we really use today is Quine. This comes from Willard Van Orman Quine, who I actually met in my college days. Came and gave a lecture at my alma mater. It was almost like having the Pope there. It was amazing. But the indeterminacy of translation, when we get right down to it, it's clearly an artistic skill, an ability that you have in order to translate it. But when you get right down to it, translation is a lie. And translating from other languages that don't even have the structure that our language has makes it, of course, even more false in a way.
In a sense, it could be more of an opinion of so somebody that would understand, that'd be doing the translating, would see it as one version, whereas another person may see it as another version, so it'd be a difference in opinion.
Oh, right. Well, I've had multiple versions. I did my master's on Hegel, and Hegel's philosophy is written in German, but German is a different language. Mark Twain explains, if you've ever read The Horrible German Language by Mark Twain, it's one of the more hilarious articles Mark Twain wrote. But the various translations of Hegel end up creating different versions of Hegel. So, plus reading German and reading Hegel gives you different versions of Hegel. So no one's in agreement what Hegel really was trying to say. But in any case, we basically have this kind of statement that, well, translation is a lie. To really understand it, you have to speak the language, but guess what? You're not really understanding it yet because you're not the author who's writing it. So just very confusing that way. Then to add to this, even if you are speaking the same language, you might have totally different meanings. One of the interesting things we have
My guest today in conversation is George Lakoff, one of America's preeminent linguists, political thinkers, and contributors to how we actually think about politics. We're going to be talking today about what Democrats who want to be elected to office should be saying.
I'm not suggesting you should.
George Lakoff, thank you for joining me today. First question for you. So what should Democrats be doing or saying right now in this very critical midterm election year?
They should say what it means to be a Democrat.
And what does it mean to be a Democrat?
A number of things. First, it means that as a Democrat, you promote the freedom and well-being of all. Number one. Two, you believe, as Lincoln said, that in a democracy, you have a government of, by, and for the people. And of means what? It means, the same people inside and out. By means same life experiences on both sides. But also, for the people means you have to take care of the people. You're doing what you would call the common good. In addition, there's a view that started with the beginning of the country, that citizens care about other citizens, work through the government to provide public resources for everybody, for both private life and private enterprise, because people are in business. And that started from the very beginning, when we had public education, when we had roads and bridges and interstate commerce and laws for not only protecting the people, but also for having a court system for business. And this is, and a patent office for business. This has been there from the very beginning, and you can't run a business